mic wasn't on.
I said that was mind-boggling at the time, but I can see now where it's coming from.
Right. Right. You have at least something to hold on to. Whether or not it's 100% accurate, you have something to which to make sense. So we've addressed two different approaches so far. We've dealt with suffering as a punishment for sin. A second response is plain and simply, you're not going to get it. Dayan ha'emet. There is order in the world. We need to feel there is order in the world. All right, and one of the answers is simply, we're not God. It's your limitation. It's our limitation.
In Genesis, it says God set the world in motion.
Mm-hmm.
God created this order, and then according to the laws of nature, we behave in a certain manner.
Well, we have human nature for sure. All right, but we also have free will. If it's just human nature, then we're bound to no choices. There's free will as well. It's both. We have human nature. I think the term that you use a lot in terms of behavior is epigenetics. There's an interaction between your genes and your cultural and your cultural environment that play together. Right. He sets it in motion. But do you believe God has stepped out of the world and has no involvement? You don't really need to answer that. This is a problem. Right. That's the dilemma. Right. That is the dilemma. Yeah. Predetermined. Right. So we're all in search of where that line is. Okay, what is God, what is human, and where's the interaction between the two? Understood, but I am teaching from a conservative perspective. Yeah, that the Reconstructionism begins at least with the premise that there's no external God, and that godliness is within us, and therefore there can't be, by the way, as a result, there can't be a commanding God. All right, there can't be law. Right, right. That's a whole nother class. The Bible itself, the Bible is different from rabbinic theology. Rabbinic theology is post-biblical, and it introduces some new concepts. While the Jews were in Persia, they were exposed to ideas the way we are here in America, and it resulted in new ideas within Judaism. And since that was 400 years before the emergence of Christianity, it played out very strongly in Christian thought too. All right? With that in mind, let's start with the Bible. In the Bible, death is final. Death marks the end of everything, including a relationship with God. There is no interaction between the dead afterlife. There's no mom and dad waiting to say hello. All right? You have no interaction with death. There is only end. It describes it as a place of maggots. It's not a perception of the afterlife that any one of us want. Even Jacob goes to Sheol. So it's not a matter of righteous or bad, good or bad. That's the biblical perspective. Because the Jews lived in Persia, after biblical times, they were exposed to a number of ideas. I said this to you. Judaism changes this concept dramatically. The first is resurrection of the human body at the end of days. We say Mechayeh HaMeitim 3 times in the Amidah, that God is the source of bringing life to the dead. Okay? It can be interpreted in lots of ways, but we say that. And the second, so that's one, Mechayeh HaMeitim, resurrection. And the second concept that enters into Judaism at this time is the idea of a soul. Okay? If you don't have a soul, there's nothing to continue into the next life. That enters Jewish thought in the 4th century before the Common Era, living among Persians. You can see it became Jewish thought in general, and it certainly was also used by Christians who came from Judaism. It's not an accident, right? This had entered the mindset of the people, but it was a cultural borrowing. All right, let me stop here in a second and say the following. We do not live a biblical Judaism. We live a rabbinic Judaism, meaning we understand the Bible through the lens of the rabbis as the rabbis understood it. And so these beliefs about an afterlife have become predominant in Jewish life. So the answer is, for us, the answer is yes, there is an afterlife, and therefore what you're asking is yes. Okay? But that is not necessarily what the Bible itself. If you read it in a literal form, it's not what it describes. We live a rabbinic Judaism. We do not live a biblical Judaism. All right? And so what you have here is, what does this enable? This enables a different understanding of suffering. If indeed someone is evil and lives a long life, punishment can happen in the afterlife. If someone is righteous and dies young, reward can happen in the afterlife. And suddenly God's sense of justice is available to us. The afterlife becomes the answer. Again, there's a lot of Okay. Again, my big mouth is getting in the way. All right. It's not, none of these work perfectly. Please understand that. None of this works perfectly. It's very convenient to be able to put off all kinds of understanding of suffering into some imaginary or possibly real world. But it's yet another Jewish answer. The graveside, there's actually a 5th form of Kaddish known as Kaddish Le'itchadata that is said in traditional families at the cemetery that somebody died. There's an extra paragraph there that we don't use. And that's reading number 5. Reading number 5 says, this is from the Kaddish that's said at the burial, okay? May his great name be magnified and sanctified in the world that is to be created anew, where he will revive the dead and raise them to eternal life. And he will rebuild the city of Jerusalem and establish his temple in its midst, and will uproot all alien worship from the earth and restore the worship of heaven to its place. There is no question about an afterlife in this version of the Kaddish. The rest of the Kaddish mentions nothing about death. Nothing. I would imagine it depends on where they are on the religious scale. Yeah. I would imagine the Dati are definitely doing this, the Chiloni are not. Okay? Okay, so we've given you now 3 different responses. I've got more. The dilemma is clear. The dilemma is, if God is omnipotent, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, then God must in some way be responsible for evil. If God is not responsible, then God is not omnipotent. Then evil exists independently of God, and God's sovereignty is severely impaired. Within normative Judaism, monotheism is so ingrained that that's an unacceptable thought. That is unacceptable. Once we establish God's ultimate responsibility for everything, it must include evil, and then the problem becomes, how do we reconcile? That's what we're trying to do here. At the same time, God's goodness is so central a tenet within Judaism that God does, when something doesn't go right, it doesn't seem that God is doing good. Right? How do we explain, make sense? God is all powerful, God is all good. But we have the right, as a result of the covenant, to turn to God and argue. And there's all sorts of wonderful texts in today's world about places where Jews have argued with God throughout centuries, and God says, good, bring it. You've got Abraham standing there at Sodom and Gomorrah saying, no, what's the story here? How can you wipe out all the bad with the good, all the good with the bad? You've got Moses saying to him, don't destroy the people of Israel. If you're going to do that, kill me too. Over and over and over throughout history, man has had the ability to turn to God and question why he's doing that. That is a Jewish way of belief. That is a Jewish response. Is to turn to God and say, I don't get it. How can you do this? So there's a range of responses we've looked at. So far, the biblical view of retribution. You bad, God punishes. The rabbinical doctrine of individual eschatology, in other words, the afterlife. The view that human freedom serves as evidence of God's self-willed decision to not control everything. Job, we don't know. Dayan Hayemet. And finally, we find Kushner. It's not finally, but one more is Kushner. Kushner was a Reconstructionist Jew, right? And so his son passed away, and he therefore engaged in the very struggle that we're talking about. Kushner's son died at 14, and his response is very personal. And he says, what are my choices? And he comes up, if you read his book, his choice at the end of the day is that God is not all-powerful. God is good. God is omnipotent, knows everything, but there are times that God just simply can't control everything. And the response he poses is that how do we deal with that? God cries with us. It's a limited theology. In other words, it's putting a limitation on traditional theology. God, at the end of the day, is not all-powerful. There are things beyond, and God cries with us.
One of the responses to the Holocaust was, God is among the suffering.
Right.
It's a hard concept.
Yep. All right. I've just realized I'm way beyond where I should, time-wise. The Holocaust takes everything we've talked about and says, no. Just no. All right? Maimonides understood evil as simply, he says, evil is simply the absence of good. It's like darkness doesn't have reality. Darkness is simply the absence of light. Evil is simply the absence of good. The Holocaust takes that and says, get rid of Maimonides, you are so wrong. There are things that are just evil. Some things are just beyond the absence of good. You can see it as God, as human will. You know, we have free will, so some people will just be evil, make evil choices. That's one possibility. And therefore, the Holocaust represents nothing more than an extreme version of normality. Or one can see it as this is so different and unprecedented, much like the genocides throughout the world in recent years, that it's so different that we have to approach it differently. All other explanations are inadequate. Rubinstein, in the 1960s, came up with a new idea, the death of God. Okay, where's the Holocaust? How do we explain it? God died, but that's not really what he said. That's what came across in the news, all right? And by the way, and it fits very comfortably with Christian theology. God died to help us overcome the suffering. Okay? Played very strongly into Christian theology. Rubinstein wasn't really saying that God had died. What he was saying is our conception of God had died. Our understanding of God that has lasted us for generations and thousands of years, that conception is dead. We need a new understanding of God. And words don't work. That was his response. Yet one more. Buber, on the other hand, talks about the eclipse of God, that there are times in which God turns away. Like you have a fight with your spouse. They're not looking you in the face. You got a couple hours before things are going to calm down. All right? Strike anybody as familiar? Right? Okay? And so, in a sense, God turns away. And there's some sense of, with the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, God withdrew from history. In that model, now we can understand how a Holocaust could happen, because now human will is free to do whatever it wants. Again, does it solve our problem? Not really. None of these do. I don't have an answer for you, but what they're really saying to us is that we don't really have a conclusive answer for why human beings are doomed to suffer. But here's another answer anyway. Okay? I got one more for you. They're all struggles. All of them are flawed in the same way. When you try to prove God rationally, there's going to have to be a leap of faith somewhere. And this is all going to require some new way of thinking. These are all traditional responses. All of them on their own don't quite get there. And all this is meant to be confronted each time you'd say, Yotzer or uvarei choshech oseh shalom uvarei et hakol. When you say that blessing and you're recognizing that God is the single source of everything, there is no competition, all this must be addressed. I hope you look at the prayer differently. And we've done three lines. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. There's a couple of weeks off, but next week I just want to remind you, on next Sunday, we don't have this class, we haven't for a while, but next Sunday at 1:15 we have the 3 sessions with Rabbi Teller, David Crone, and me on the high holidays from different approaches. My session is going to be about the Torah reading for the second day, the binding of Isaac, and how do we make sense of a difficult text that we read. What's that? This is here. I gave out the schedule. They're all. Yeah, you got it? Yeah. The schedule is here, although today should have been September 50th. It does say here. Schedule is here. And if you miss a Sunday, you can see there's an alternative Wednesday where I'm teaching the same thing. Something we would have just did this Wednesday night. I'll give you the answer. I'll have a definitive response. And please sign the board this way. If I'm sick, I can send you a note saying, please stay in bed and relax and enjoy your Sunday. All right? Yes.
While you were talking about all this, I was thinking, I just watched All in the Family, I think it's called. And there was an episode, it was anyhow, one of the friends passed away and was killed because of this. And Ian was in the kitchen, the last part of the story, and she had something else.
I think she was indicted.
Indicted?
Signed up, so I know you were here.
I signed